and thank you for the opportunity to address you today on a topic which is so relevant. We live in the VUCA world, and also how the COVID-19 pandemic is impacting on South African agriculture and actually the whole agro-food system or value chain. So I want to share some thoughts with you on this. There are a couple of similarities with last year's presentation, but obviously the environment has changed considerably. So last year at the AFMA AGM, I indicated that we live in this VUCA world, the world of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, and now we have VUCA squared, if I can call it that, with the COVID pandemic right across the world, and how do we deal with this? So I'm going to share some thoughts with you on what I think are the most important things that we need to look at in our agro-food system. And you are big role players in that agro-food system. So we firstly need to look at the political economy, both globally and in African context, the risks and challenges, also add major South African risks and challenges that we have. I'm going to again touch shortly on food security and competitiveness imperative, because that drives our food system. We need to look at confidence and growth in the South African agriculture system, major developments in the legislative and policy environment in which we operate, the COVID-19 impact, and then we can wrap up. So we see this new multipolar global power dynamic developing. There's this huge power shift to Asia. Also, many of them are BRICS countries like India, China, Russia, and the role that they play. But it's not just with them. BRICS is also very disparate, and it's more a political conglomerate than it is a real trading bloc. What's very important in the power dynamics, though, is the USA versus China trade and technology war, and the impact that it will have on the power dynamics. It started with a trade war, but it has expanded into technology war, Huawei and 5G obviously becoming the new terrain, and then also programs like TikTok, etc. Middle East tensions will continue, and it's why it's important for South Africa is from two aspects. Firstly, from an energy security point of view, our oil purchases are from the Middle East, and then also as an export destination, which has become very important for us, especially the United Arab Emirates, but also Lebanon, also Saudi Arabia, etc. So we need to monitor what's happening there. Brexit and European unity are obviously still paramount. The EU and the UK are pretty much economically depressed at the moment, especially the United Kingdom, and those are really important destinations for our exports. We need to look at Africa's demographic dividend, also the global population, because we're in the food business and people must eat. And so we need to know where the people are. So what is the population size per country? And we can clearly see how China and India dominate with over 36% of the world's population in those countries. But also other countries like Indonesia, Brazil, United States, Russia, etc., and African countries. We have export markets that we need and want to service in the process. So Africa's is only about 17% of global population, but less than 5% of global GDP. So your buying power is limited. China and India, 36% of your global population, but only 18.7% of global GDP. But that is growing. And so it makes it very attractive in terms of future markets. If we look at the GDP, then we'll see the United States still roughly 25% of GDP, United States and Canada. And then we look at Asia, with China, Japan, Russia, India, the major countries in terms of GDP, also together roughly 25%. And then the next 25% is Europe, that's the green bloc, with Germany, United Kingdom, France, etc. And then the other 25% is South America, Brazil, Mexico, other countries, and Australia. And South Africa and African countries are small in relation to this. South Africa only about 0.44% of global GDP. So there's a big space to play in, and our export destinations cover many of these countries, and we need to increase that. So what's happening in Africa? That's the one place that that is strong growth in population, and the dark red countries indicate countries that of more than 6 births per woman. The slightly more orange color is more than 5, between 5 and 6 births per woman, and then it comes down. So you can clearly see West Africa, Central Africa, East Africa are areas where there is huge population growth. But those are also the areas that are very food insecure, as you will see just now. So Africa's population will exceed 2 billion by 2050 and 4 billion by 2100. Now, that's either a massive opportunity or a massive risk, and a critical risk that we need to address. It creates opportunity for us in our markets, but then those markets can afford the food that we produce. So interconnectivity is still a major driver, even though globalization has taken a little bit of a backseat with general protectionist and localization developments. Even in South Africa, we're looking at greater localization with government. COVID-19 certainly has hit globalization very hard, but it will only retard it for a while. It won't stop it. Mass migration, which is an outcome of conflict and globalization, was rampant before COVID-19, and COVID-19 did stop it. But it will pick up again for sure as we get past COVID-19. Environmental sustainability issues very important, also for our sector in which we work. Climate change and extreme weather phenomena, water availability and quality, biodiversity loss, pollution and waste are issues that we all need to address in our businesses and in our sector. Biosecurity issues, so important, but from a human point of view, COVID-19 and other outbreaks that we might have, animal and plants, and especially as you're also in the animals and plant business, basically, we've got to watch these more closely. Okay, then very important, global GDP is projected at minus 4.9, say contraction of about 5% for 2020, but then will rebound by 5.4% in 2021, and this is according to IMF. South Africa, however, will have a greater contraction in 2020, probably in the region of 8 to 10%. It might even go higher if Eskom fails us and we have continuous load shedding in the process. Okay, if we look at South Africa's political economy, I know there's an address on this, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but more how it impacts on our industry. The ANC remains in massive turmoil. We've seen that over this past weekend. Again, and there are huge divisions and distrust, even the commissions of inquiry around corruption, etc. We still believe that President Ramaphosa's SONA in February 2020 is a move in the right direction. The biggest problem from the state side is the capability of the state to perform. And its capability has been hugely eroded. We see that in SOEs, but we see that in many departments not being able to carry out the basic functions that they need to carry out. So our biggest concern is lack of GDP growth, competitiveness decline, and escalating debt in South Africa. And let's just look at some of the figures. We saw a great increase in our GDP from 2001 to roughly 2010, growing up to 417 billion in US dollars. It's important to measure this in US dollars so that we take the rand depreciating effect out. And then obviously under the Zuma administration, in the dark years, it decreased to 295 billion US dollars, but has increased again in the last 2 years to 351 billion US dollars. Now, per capita from 2011 to 2016, we decreased from 8,000 US dollars per person to 5,200 US dollars per person. That means that we all became 25% poorer over that period. Very important to note that, but there has been a little bit of a rebound. So we decoupled from global growth from around 2012, 2013, and this is because of the structural problems in our economy, corruption, policy uncertainty, confidence was lost in the country, and investment also basically was cut very significantly. So the coronavirus came and it has caused its own problems. So we what I want to do is just give you a sense of what's happening economically, how National Treasury sees it, and basically look at the supplementary budget that was then tabled in Parliament in June 2020. And we have to rebuild given the COVID pandemic. Now, the problem that we have is a major fiscal problem, and it's the gap between revenue, state revenue through taxes, and expenditure by the state. And what has happened is this has widened considerably to over 300 billion rand. And so what you have to then do is you have to go and borrow more to finance that shortfall. So our main budget revenue, you can see, is the grey line that has declined or is declining very strongly. Less tax, also because of customs and duty taxes, but also because of income, personal income tax, and even company tax that is reduced. And then our expenditure has been much higher to cater for support programs to people, the health care expenditure, etc. And this obviously is not sustainable. Minister Tito, when he talks of the mouth of the hippopotamus that we must close, and this is going to be very difficult to do. So our debt outlook does not look good. And if we do not come in with a zero budgeting approach and also implementing a debt ceiling, we are going to run into what we call the passive scenario. And as soon as we breach over 100% debt in relation to GDP, we are going to face a sovereign debt crisis. We will see a run on the rand. And what will happen is what has happened in Turkey and Argentina, where the value of in Argentina of their peso basically halved within 6 months. And I saw that with my own eyes visiting that country a year ago. So we got to get debt under control. South African debt is already over 3 trillion rand, and to service that debt is incredibly difficult. So look at our debt service costs as a proportion of our main budget. We can see that it will increase to close to 22% of total revenue. Now that means that more than 1 rand out of every 5 rand that is collected by SARS goes to paying just interest, servicing our debt, in other words. And this is obviously not sustainable. It takes away money that should be spent on services to the population around healthcare, around education, etc., economic activity, etc. And this is where our big problem lies. We've got to now get our debt under control. Right, we also stuck with massive unemployment, which has just been exacerbated by the COVID situation, especially amongst the youth too. We are a very unequal country, and while we are so unequal, we're going to get a lot of populist calls, and demands will persist. We will see increasing protests. The pressure will be on water and land reform, even expropriation without compensation. And we see the nationalization of the Reserve Bank also coming under pressure right now in Parliament, as the EFF have tabled what they call a private members' bill on nationalizing the Reserve Bank. Crime and security is becoming a major problem. We see that with farm murders and farm and rural safety issues. Terrible murder again this past weekend of the farmers in Northern Natal. There were actually 4 farm attacks this past weekend. So crime is becoming a massive problem as we sit with this huge problem with unemployment. Okay, let's look at food security and competitiveness. I'm going to go through this very quickly. You know the concepts already. Global food security is measured by The Economist in its Global Food Security Index. There are 4 components to food security. It's the availability of food, in other words, the production and sufficiency of supply, etc. Food affordability, which is a really important criterion, and then food quality and safety. That's around nutritional standards, protein quality, food safety, which you are all very involved in, also important. And your 4th element is time. And when you hit the sweet spot with all those 3, then you have a good sense of food security. Big problem is the purchasing power is the key to access of food. And this is where we fall short in South Africa. So it's a complex concept. But South Africa is number one in Africa and actually falls into what we call the good quartile. We ranked 47th in the world out of about 170, 180 countries. But we have one major problem, that our household food security is a problem. It is a risk that because more than 20% of our households are food insecure. They do not earn enough to can buy the food that they require. So competitiveness is measured again on a country basis by the World Economic Forum. The concept is very well established. We declined from 47th in the world to 67th in 2018, but improved to 60th in 2019. So there is some positive signs. Unfortunately, COVID has impacted now, has intervened, and this will put a lot of pressure on our competitiveness. Also, our South African agriculture sector, both primary and agro-processing, and the total agriculture is the blue line, has improved since 2007, working hard with government to improve that competitiveness. So let's go to the South African agricultural sector and we look at its confidence and its growth. And agriculture growth is very up and down, very volatile because of weather conditions, and a lot of policy uncertainty issues also creeping in the last 2-3 years. So we've only been growing in real terms by about 1.4% per annum, which is not sufficient. We should be growing at more than that. At least we've been growing, must be said as well. We've had some bad years the last few years, 2014, 2015, 2016, big drought. Then we had a good maize crop in 2017 that helped our value add, because that's what GDP measures, it's your value add. But then 2018, 2019, very dry. And then 2020 and the end of 2019 have been much better. And we're already seeing a positive tick up in our growth. And we expect our growth to grow as much as our sector to grow by as much as 10%. That's primary agriculture, even up to 15% in 2020. I think the big thing is if we look at the BFAP figures, it's basically exactly the same graph. This is just on an annual basis. The previous one was on a quarter-on-quarter basis. If they look at the baseline that BFAP, Bureau for Food and Agriculture Policy, do, they foresee real agriculture GDP to be very sideways over the next 10 years, unless we bring in structural reforms into our agricultural sector. Then we can bend the curve upwards to generate better growth. And this is what we need to do. We need to see how we can bend that curve to get better growth. Confidence at the moment, or the last quarter, was very low, but one can understand that because of the pandemic. There was so much uncertainty as to how this is going to pan out and what the damage is going to be to the economy. Positive impact is still one on our agricultural imports, or actually more our exports, and our positive trade balance. So the graph, or the y-axis, is in US dollars, so it takes out the depreciation of the rand. So it's in effect a real terms growth that we can see in our exports, and in the past 2 years exported in excess of $10 billion US. So that's a lot of money. That's a lot of exports of agricultural products, and hats off to our sectors that have been achieving this. And you can clearly see the upward trend in our trade balance. That's the green line from 2007, and a lot of good growth in our exports in 2020 as well. In our fruit sector, massively for citrus, also table grapes, the second best season ever, citrus the best season. So our fruit has done very well. We're exporting also quite a lot of maize, second biggest crop this year. And a lot of wine going out at the moment. We had good wine season, so it's very positive in terms of our positive trade balance and opportunities. But we have to work hard with government to improve this and create a real public-private partnership, because we need government so that we can access these export markets. So where are we exporting to? Up to 2009, primarily the EU. Since then, it has been Africa. That's the green line. But that has also plateaued off because of the buying power and the supermarket phenomenon has come to a halt. The big expansion was on the back of ShopRite, Checkers, and these guys, Pick n Pay, Spar, Woolworths, moving into Africa, and they took a lot of South African product with them. But some of them are even divesting. We see ShopRite moving out of Nigeria, Angola, etc. And so this Africa does, while there are still opportunities, perhaps also through the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, we need to look at other markets. And so Europe becomes very important, and it has been ticking up, as well as Asia is actually where we see a lot of opportunity, and we have to work hard on that. So if we look where our exports on agriculture went in 2018, the purple is all Africa. So Namibia, Botswana, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Lesotho, Zambia, very important. In Europe, it's Netherlands, United Kingdom, Germany, the dominant ones. Asia, it's China and Hong Kong. They can actually go together. Japan, India, more and more South Korea, United Arab Emirates, as I mentioned earlier. This year to the United States of America, a lot of citrus went into the USA. So very important that we also keep those markets going. The other big pool is manufacturing. And agro-processing is already 25% of total manufacturing output in South Africa, and around, well, closer even to 4% of gross domestic product now. So our agro-processing has been growing very well. And both your exports and your agro-processing actually create the pool for primary production. And very important that we keep our agro-processing growing. Often it's asked, how does this growth relate to jobs? So in the primary sector, and we work from 2012 as our base because that's the year that the National Development Plan was released, we've seen 20% growth in primary agriculture jobs, which is actually fantastic. And in agro-processing, we've also seen a roughly 19% growth since 2012 in number of jobs created. So industry is creating jobs. Our whole value chain is creating jobs. And that's why government our sector and prioritize our sector because of the stability and the job creating potential that it has. Let's just look at some major developments in legislative and policy environments. When we talk to government, these following 6 aspects consistently come up: inclusive growth and job creation, and I've alluded to that now. Land reform obviously is also high on the agenda. Climate change and how we deal with climate change, very important. Water rights, regulations, and water infrastructure. We are a dry country, and we need to adapt our systems to better and water use efficiency, etc. Because agriculture uses 60% of all water in South Africa. Infrastructure constraints in some farming areas, especially former homelands, but also infrastructure constraints in terms of rail network, which affects you. Also in terms of the ports, etc., which also affects you. And then international trade. And I've alluded to this in terms of market access. We have to work closely with government to expand our export markets to create opportunity for new entrants. And we need export-led growth in South Africa. That is how we're going to grow, through export-led growth. So if we look at some fields of policy and legislation, credit legislation, very important, especially the new Credit Amendment Act that was passed, and around the affordability assessments. We need more flexibility around this for the agri sector, and this is around reckless lending. Then we're also developing, and we've been leading on this blended finance developments with the Department of Agriculture and Government National Treasury, which is in the final stages now. Carbon tax and climate change acts and bills are very important. Labor legislation is basically finalized, but the employment equity one is one that we have to watch. And then there's obviously water legislation and land reform legislation. I want to just touch on the water and land reform too. So if we look at land reform legislation, we're looking at Section 25 amendment to the Constitution. That's on the so-called expropriation without compensation. The committee in Parliament has been re-established and will continue with hearings on that. The expropriation bill has passed through NEDLAC and has now to be tabled in Parliament. Then also the Property Valuation Act, We need to review the regulations, and that will commence soon due to certain court actions and court rulings that have been issued. And then we have the comprehensive producer development support policy from the Department of Agricultural, Land Reform and Rural Development that is currently in NEDAC, and where we lead from Agbiz side on that task team. On the water issue, the master plan has been finalized, but we still see no movement on the following legislation: the amendments to the water use license regulations, the economic regulator for water, the single catchment management area concept, and the merging of the National Water Act and the Water Services Act. And this is very important. So while you have a master plan, we still need the legislation aspects. And so we see, because legislation is not being developed and enacted, we see quite a lot of issues landing up in court. For example, Forestry South Africa taking the department to court on the so-called existing lawful use, ELUs, and this matter was fortunately settled out of court. And then also on the prohibition of water trading. And this also needs to be sorted out still. It's on appeal, the court case that was brought by Water Use Association. What are we doing from Agbiz side? We are major stakeholders in this, and we are meeting with, and the stakeholders are meeting with the department in court, and we need to keep this out of the courts and get this sorted out. It's a much better way of doing it through dialogue. So Agbiz has submitted certain scenarios on water management to the ministerial advisors. We have very good contact with them, and we're in a very good position to make proposals, but we'll need buy-in from all stakeholders. Agbiz forms part of the BUSA working group, that's Business Unity South Africa, with broader industry, because we must understand that there is competition for water also with other industries. And then we also work on a platform with all farmers' organizations on the water issue. The just transition is a move to a green economy, and we are busy with that. Given the problems with Eskom, we need to, in any case, move to renewable energy, but we need to do this through a just transition and to fight climate change. Government has been too passive on this, and business has got to play a much bigger role in this approach. And I think the COVID-19 economic recovery actually creates an opportunity to go more green. So we are dealing with this just transition with government at the moment so that we can create new jobs. Unfortunately, 25% of South Africa's workforce is currently in carbon-intensive industries. We have to reskill them. We have to get them into new jobs that are green. So there's a national business initiative, BUSA Just Transition Initiative, in which we are playing a major role. The target is net zero carbon emissions by 2050. This does not mean zero emissions, but we need then the equivalent through so-called sequestrated carbon. It creates a lot of investment opportunities. It creates threats, certainly for certain areas in agriculture, but also creates an opportunity for us to shape a greener and a more sustainable environment. We also need to note carbon tax issues. The SARS rules have been amended somewhat. Also, your first payment deferred from 1 July to 1 October. Climate change bill still to return to NEDLAC. They withdrew it from NEDLAC to bring it in line with carbon tax. The Preservation and Development of Agricultural Land bill was finalized and is due to be submitted to Parliament now. And then also we've, through the Job Summit, looked at road to rail issues. That research has been concluded, very important for you, for your industry. And then public-private partnership proposals for SPSP to be presented to Fruit Desk Steerco. And we are looking to create capacity within the department to address some of the SPS matters that we are trying to deal with. So we engage with government on various platforms bilaterally, also through CEO Forum, etc., where you also sit. Through NEDLAC, the NEDLAC Act enforces a social dialogue, and we are very well positioned within NEDLAC, both through the Trade and Industry Chamber and also through the Tesaluka, which is the Trade Agreements Chamber. Also through, we work through the Job Summit in NEDLAC, Trade and Industry Chamber, where I'm the convener, Development, Labour Market, and the Public Finance and Monetary Policy Chambers. We're also involved with the Public-Private Growth Initiative, which creates great access to us to various ministers and to the President. And then we've engaged on the master plan process as well. And in the master plan process, and this is what President Ramaphosa said, is we need to create inclusive growth, and we agree with that. It must be founded on a partnership between government, labour and industry, and agriculture and agro-processing is one of those industries. And basically we create these master plans to ensure that infrastructure, skills, incentives and other resources are directed towards where they have the greatest impact. And we agree with this. So we are trying to work out, it has its challenges, but we are trying to work with Labour and government to come up with a new master plan that will address and make sure that we have inclusive growth in society in South Africa. So just on the COVID, we've seen global developments, we've seen domestic impacts, we've seen had government engagement, and we're developing the inclusive growth strategy, as I said, for the master plan, which has also come through the COVID-19 reaction. So we've seen major supply and demand disruptions. This is stabilizing quite nicely now. What we have seen too is demand side changes through changes to consumer patterns on food spend. So they're looking for healthier foods and fresh foods, etc. We've seen some initial protectionist policies and trade restrictions. Most of these have been lifted. Logistical supply chain issues, food waste amid closure of restaurants, QSRs, even in South Africa, labor shortages due to lockdown, agro-processing, workplace closures due to COVID-19 cases, especially in America, meat packers, etc. And then we also see grain and oilseed situation, positive growth both in supply and demand. And I was talking specifically also of maize and soybeans, which are obviously fundamental to your industry. So the International Grains Council report that's just recently come out shows quite positive growth in supply, but also in demand, and a pretty good balance at this stage, and increases in prices as well, which creates opportunity for the producers also of these products in South Africa. So South African agriculture has not been as hard hit by the COVID pandemic. We were already constrained because of the droughts in 2018, 2019, and the outbreaks of foot and mouth disease, etc. But we see at least a 10% year-on-year recovery in South African agriculture GDP for 2020. A number of agricultural products were not classified as essential services, and that did cause problems. For example, wool, cotton, mohair, wine industries. Wine and tobacco are still under a lot of pressure because of the ban that was in place on sales. Fortunately, this has now been lifted, but those industries especially will be hard hit. Exports of all our agricultural products are now allowed, and our port capacity has improved considerably, but it still remains a concern. But I must take my hat off. We've had a massive export season of all our fruit, especially citrus, and we got through it, and I didn't think we would. So some really positive aspects around the ports. We're also encouraged by changes in the Transnet top structure, where we're working on an agri-strategy with the head of operations and head of strategy that are really assisting us nicely, and we would like to engage with AFMA and also Sakota on these matters going forward. Yes, there are concerns about global demand for SA exports, so we're going to have to work really hard to maintain these exports. Local demand has also declined. It's starting to pick up again with the restaurants opening and QSRs, quick service restaurants opening as well. Problem is into Africa. Roughly 40% of our exports go into Africa. Africa's GDP, as I indicated, is low. Per capita growth is going to take a knock with COVID, so we might not get the exports to Africa that we want, and then we'll have to look for other markets. Just some other additional impacts, which I think been positive. The South African Reserve Bank has cut interest rates by 300 basis points. That means a 5 billion rand interest saving for farmers alone over the next 12 months. And I don't think we can expect further interest rate cuts because we see inflation starting to tick up just a little bit, and I think they will try and keep that under control. There has been some aid that has gone to 15,000 small-scale farmers, but we do see confidence, and the sub-investment grade will impact, the transmission effects will have an impact on agribusiness confidence. Worried about the land bank defaults again this past week, and it holds significant systemic risk to South African agriculture, because the land bank is responsible for 29% of South Africa's farm debt. That is significant. So there's a bit of a liquidity crunch in agriculture, and especially on the development impact, we are a bit concerned. So we've engaged government through various work streams, also the economic work stream, where we could provide detailed reports to Minister Didiza, Minister Patel, to the National COVID Command Center on exactly what's happening in the different supply chains in our agri-food system. You were involved, AFMA, in this process, and thank you very much for your participation. Every 48 hours we could put a report on the minister's table and tell them how the sector was doing. It was a fantastic effort, and I was fortunate to can lead on the economic work stream. Business for SA, very involved in economic interventions and getting agriculture in as an essential goods services and checking all the supply chain security issues, infrastructure and logistics. Keeping the harbours open, the ports open, was partly through these engagements. We also developed an economic recovery strategy, which we're also using for the master plan. Then also developments around food security in Gauteng with the Premier's office, and then various bilateral engagement with ministers and senior government officials from time to time. So we're also looking at, Business for SA is looking at a new inclusive economic growth strategy that we presented to the President. And just to highlight, in the whole value chain, the agri-food system, output amounts to 1.9 trillion, and primary agriculture about 250 billion, and responsible for 7% of employment. But if you look at the whole value chain right to retail, retail in South Africa, retail and wholesale is about 20% contribution to GDP, of which half is food and beverages. So if you look at the whole agri-food, agri-beverage value chain, it's roughly 15% of total GDP. So we play a very significant role in the South African economy, creating jobs, as I've indicated already. So there are 5 major structural issues that we want to be addressed. It's access to finance, get land reform done in a responsible manner, water infrastructure, develop that, transport infrastructure, and then access to new markets, especially also international markets. So take home on COVID is we have a pretty resilient and robust agri-food beverage fiber system. Again, a major asset to our country in terms of national food security. It did expose some fault lines and vulnerabilities, especially in the logistics and infrastructure, also in the informal food market system, and roughly 40% of our food goes into the informal market system. Isaac Breitenbach from SAPA told me that roughly 30% of all fowls produced goes into the market system through live fowls, not slaughtered, but into the informal market system. And we know roughly 40 to 50% of fresh produce goes through the bakkie traders from this fresh market, municipal fresh market system. So this is something that we need to look at and to explore further and to develop further. So there's still great uncertainty around the pandemic, how it will play out. Will we get a vaccine? Will a vaccine be effective? When will the situation stabilize? Will there be new mutants coming out of this COVID-19, etc.? So we still don't know exactly what the impact will be on the demand side. So there's still a great amount of uncertainty, and we need to be prepared to adapt. It might very well be that it is not business usual going forward, but rather business unusual. So just to wrap up, we have a relatively healthy and robust agri-food system, but it has its pressures. We must understand its challenges. around investment environment, agri-logistics, water availability, environmental sustainability, R&D, crime and security, labor issues, land reform, climate change, droughts, trade agreements, sustainable transformation. But there are also many opportunities. Growing population, consumer spending trends, new markets, especially Africa and Asia, new technologies and improved productivity. So it's a major contributor to food security growth and employment, a major asset in South Africa, and you play a major role in those value chains and food security. But we live in uncertain times, many risks and variables. Some we can control, others to a lesser degree, and some that we can control. And we must concentrate on those risks and opportunities that we understand and that we can manage. We must also understand that risk brings opportunity and reward, and we need to plan strategically to make use of those opportunities. So thank you very much.